Obviously, there was a lot of backlash from a lot of the population in China. We saw the extraordinary scenes of demonstrations of protests, which in a country as authoritarian as China takes real courage to get out there in the street. You risk a long term in prison, and there was a lot of unrest around the country. Xi Jinping has obviously had to back down and respond to that. And I think there was genuine anger. I think that a lot of the public felt it had just been gone on too long and too hard. And the notion of zero COVID in this day and age is almost like saying zero flu or zero any other disease. It just wasn't achievable. And in the end, even someone as authoritarian and unresponsive as Xi Jinping backed down.
Well, economically, how damaging has this policy been for China? And do you think this could be Xi Jinping's downfall when the effects really start to be felt everywhere, if they aren't already?
Look, I think it would be a very brave person to predict the downfall of Xi Jinping. He's probably, the most powerful and strongly entrenched Chinese leader since Mao Zedong, having got that third term. I don't think there's any real suggestion of his downfall. I think that he has set up the apparatus around himself, the mechanics of the Communist Party, so that any dissent is dealt with brutally, and there is very little public resistance to him. So I don't think that there's any sort of downfall, but I think that China has really felt the pain of the zero COVID. But almost more than that, I think China is now, its economy is actually now suffering from Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine. And if anything is going to encourage Vladimir Putin to stop his war in Ukraine, the only person really who has leverage over him in this day and age is Xi Jinping. And it may well be self-interest of China because, of course, the Ukraine war has led to all sorts of problems in the energy market, in the supply lines around the world. And I think that may well encourage China to try to bring an end to that war.
Well, in October, China approved the removal of the two-term limit on the presidency, as we know, effectively allowing Xi Jinping to remain in power for life. How significant was this development when we look back on it?
Well, very significant, Yvonne, and essentially it did entrench him as president for life. He'd already had those 2 terms, that was his limit. He wanted more, so he changed the rules, which takes him to at least 12 years, and there's no suggestion that he's going to be happy ending at that. So he's extremely well entrenched in China. There's no obvious opposition to him because who would be game in China? We've seen what's happened to people who show dissent in China. It was significant because essentially he will now mark this era as his time. He wants to have that legacy of one of the great Chinese leaders, which of course can mean Hong Kong, can mean Taiwan, can mean taking China, expanding China to Greater China. So I think that that's the reason it was very significant, is that it's rested in him extraordinary power.
Well, how has it impacted global perception of China and its leaders?
Well, I think it's made foreign countries, the United States, Australia and others, realise that if you're going to do any business with China in any way, if you're going to try to get your citizens out or you're going to try to do any deals, financial, economic deals, essentially you have to try to work with Xi Jinping. A lot of countries around the world, of course, don't like his style of things. They don't like what he does, but there's no doubt who's in charge of China. And China, when it looks at the United States, internally, China thinks, well, there's a fairly weak leader there, Joe Biden, who may or may not run for another term. There's a possibility of Donald Trump returning. So the Chinese are almost gloating when they look at the United States. They looked at those January 6 riots, and their view was, look at our stability compared to yours. And of course, we know the reason. We know that democracies, where people can express their opinion, often do look messy and often do look rather chaotic.
Well, tensions with the US did spike in August over Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, but things seem to have settled since then.
They have for the moment, but the issue of Taiwan won't go away. Xi Jinping has said very, very clearly that if necessary, I will take Taiwan by force He's used that word more than once. And so now it's a matter of what's in his head. Now, obviously, he would have been watching closely Ukraine and seeing the resistance to Vladimir Putin. That wasn't done in the 3 or 4 days that Vladimir Putin thought it was. This time last year, of course, there was no Ukraine war. And then in January, we saw those images of Xi Jinping meeting Vladimir Putin. Clearly, or one would presume that Vladimir Putin would have made it clear to Xi Jinping that he was about to invade Ukraine. He did so a few weeks later. So Xi Jinping would be looking at that and thinking, the United States and Europe and other countries have really come in hard. Do I really want to disrupt the global financial markets? Now, Russia, in a way, has gone rogue. It doesn't really care if it disrupts financial markets, whereas the Chinese, of course, are the great beneficiaries of finance and international trade.
And lastly, John, and very quickly, this year we've seen the resumption of dialogue between Australia and China. Will we see further progress in this relationship?
I think so, Yvonne. I was in Bali for the famous meeting between Xi Jinping and Anthony Albanese. That broke that 5 years of no contact at all between ministers. That was a significant meeting. It not just meant that the leaders of China and Australia could talk again, but the message, the way China works, of course, is that the message would have gone through to all the other ministers. For several years, not one Australian minister, even a junior minister, could get their counterpart in China on the phone. That's all changing now. We're seeing with Penny Wong and Anthony Albanese, they're re-engaging with China. Now, what Anthony Albanese wants from that is he wants to have the $20 billion of sanctions that the Chinese have put on Australian goods. He wants that lifted. So that's his main game in trying to improve that relationship.
John Lyons, great to get your views. Thank you so much.